Hey everyone, this is Barum, and today I want to discuss the truth about audio plugins, particularly the many that have claimed to have successfully cloned the real pieces of hardware. Some will promote these plugins as being indistinguishable from the hardware, while others will carefully and diplomatically say they are different, but just as good. The truth is, these plugins are inferior to their real hardware counterparts. Ask yourself, why have some been cloned so many times and all sound and behave differently from each other? You may also find yourself regularly questioning why famous professionals such as Andrew Scheps and others claim they now work strictly in the box using plugins, while others like Chris Lord-Alge insist on still working completely analog. For you, the consumer, it's easy to see where this constant differing information gets blurred and convoluted, especially with someone like Chris Lord-Alge, who has promoted and released name-brand specific software and audio plugins for many years, like his CLA Mixdown, CLA Mix Hub, 1176, LA2A, and 3A for Waves Audio. But, as a very beloved educational show from my childhood would have put it, don't take my word for it. Here's a quote from CLA himself, 22 minutes and 43 seconds into a recent Waves Audio video titled Mixing Masterclass, Secrets of the Mix with Chris Lord-Alge, where he states, "You know they invented Pro Tools and all this stuff because it was a cheaper way to make audio. So, don't think you're working on the highest technology that there is in the world. We're just trying to make it work. The highest technology in the world was consoles and outboard gear, and then adding electronics to work with it." To me, this says it all. And I must admit, I find this both humorous and ironic that he lets this slip in a video promoting plugins. By the way, guys, I'll leave the link to that video in the description, and also let me know if Waves ever takes down that video after I post this, because it would not be the first time in the media or even the audio world where things get quote-unquote erased out of documentation or accessible via the internet. If you don't believe me, look up everything you can find about the hardware version of the Waves L2 Ultra Maximizer. And maybe Sound on Sound magazine can chime in and tell me why I can no longer find the article they originally made on the unit. I'll tell you why. Because a company that creates both software and hardware is counter-conducive to itself when pushing a narrative that the software is just as good or better. This is the same dilemma you will find in other companies today doing the same thing, such as Manley Laboratories and Chandler Limited. And I love and own hardware from both these companies. So why do even these reputable hardware companies partake? The answer is, why not? They want to get a piece of the action and a piece of that consumer pie as well, and they should have every right to do so. Doing so also further promotes and perpetuates their brand. The fact of the matter is, it's cheaper, easier, and more accessible to the consumer market. But make no mistake about it, you and I are the consumer market. So yes, despite it being contradictory to their own marketing strategies and ethos, brands such as Manley Labs with their snazzy yet elitist slogan, Tubes Rule, in vain of their audiophile market, where they can get away with selling a $20,000 tube amplifier for your home stereo, can also license their name, and I guess you can say sound, to companies like Universal Audio, where the talking heads can push it to you, the consumer, as being just like the real thing. On the argument of quality, it just doesn't add up. So you may ask yourself at this point, what makes the real hardware so great, and why can't plugins fully model their sound and character? I will answer this question in two parts. Part 1. They can, but, and it's a big but, they can't yet. Not even close. We may even be decades away from where it's convenient and conducive to replicate all the aspects of these circuits in digital form. Look to native run software versus hardware DSP assisted stuff as an attempted example of this. You have to understand, the way they create these plugins is so that it'll work for everyone, or at least as many people with a modern computer without much fuss. That means whether you have a fancy 16-core CPU with all the RAM in the world, or a minimalist laptop setup, you will still be able to use these plugins and probably 10 or 20 instances of them within your already 100-plus plugin-filled project. Corners must be cut. Let's put it this way. And this is only my rough theory relative to how I understand the market as well as the baseline of performance and ability of current-day consumer computer technology. In order to truly closer replicate, for instance, a Class A preamp circuit, with all its nuances and non-linearities, you would probably need a computer 5 to 10 times the power of your current one. And this would only be to run one single instance of the program. Remember, these are completely arbitrary numbers to show my point. As you may have seen in television technology, 1080p to 4K to 8K, the perception of quality is not equal to the resource and technology being implemented and achieved. In other words, the effort is not always worth the return, and this can't be any truer when it comes to how technology exponentially advances. Basically, when it comes to audio plugins, it's not worth it yet and not convenient to put so much into them for such little perceivable return, compounded by not having the power to do so conveniently. And so, they hash out the meat of what the functions are and try to amalgamate a look, feel, and behavior that is perceived acceptable to most. The most bang for your buck. On the obvious plus side, that doesn't take away from the fact that it does give you a quicker, cheaper way to get your hands on and have a taste of what these real devices can do. And for these reasons, it's awesome, or how the Brits would say, brilliant. But it's still a compromise. And that is simply my argument. Most plugins are still static interpretations of the hardware. So here's part 2 of my answer, and I hope this isn't becoming quite the unfollowable tangent. So what's really wrong with them? Here's where it gets interesting, and why I find that I don't really want to use most anymore. Phase. Lest all the other attributes of plugins failing to completely replicate the dimensions of a piece of hardware, the root of all issues lies in phase. So what do I mean? In simple terms, to me, most plugins sound as flat as they look on the screen. Producer and engineer Eric Valentine described it as holes while shooting out a plugin to an old Simon's EQ. P.S. I love you, Eric. Whereas he said the hardware sounded seamless. Phase. The details of phase shift is for a completely other video, but to say the least, most things in audio comes down to phase. I know you've all heard of the polarity button on your DAW or piece of gear, and most of you know about how phase is very important when lining up multiple microphones to a single source. You may also be familiar with the phase shift that happens on an EQ when you move and manipulate the frequencies. Phase shift is actually true for any moment of time when manipulating a piece of audio, and in a mix's case, that relative phase relationship within the given time of the occurrence and how multiple tracks sum together. Let's break that down to a more simple example. When I use most plugins, I hear the sound spectrum flatten. I hear it skew. Plugins are not able to replicate the top end or low end like their analog counterparts. Makers sometimes hide this in the top end by inducing noise shaping and low-pass filters. This also means that, let's say, the highs, mids, and lows can become out of alignment with each other, and thus arrive at your ears at different times. This is why things can start sounding blurred or smeared in certain frequency ranges, or between frequencies within your source. This is also why people describe analog sometimes as being wider sounding in stereo instances. Another culprit that we won't be getting into in this video is aliasing. That's for another time. But even aliasing and noise comes back to the phase relationship between the frequencies. So let's use this analogy. If your stereo audio was the walls of a long hallway, right and left, would it be easier to see the end of that hallway if the walls were straight or bent and skewed? This is the width or inversely smeared effect that can occur with interharmonic phase shift. The good news is, mixing is all about corralling these frequencies together within the given linear time frame of your song. Side note, while I'm not going to get into the benefits of oversampling in this discussion, there are certain things it can improve upon. And so, can you mix with plugins? Yes. Can you get good sounds from them and a good mix? Arguably, yes. Can you still invoke someone's emotions musically? Yes. But, do they sound and behave just like the real thing? No. And thus, my argument is they are a compromise, despite being a convenient one. And so to the famous mixing engineers who currently push and promote plugins and claim they have moved completely in the box, I argue that their best mixes are behind them and they are able to sit on their laurels and fame while taking the convenient way out. I also argue that I myself, being nobody but an obsessed music lover, musician, and engineer, has probably had more years working with these plugins than they have. More on that point later. Andrew Scheps claims, and this is a paraphrase, that once the audio has turned into digital format, plugins are perfectly competent in manipulating the signal. He even goes as far as to fearmonger the use of analog to digital conversion, saying that this has more of a degradation on your sound than using software. This is wrong. In my experience, when using most modern and professional audio conversion, even at 44.1, the benefits of running through a good piece of hardware far outweigh any degradation. There's a video from Mixbus TV with David agreeing my point. I'll leave it to you to add up why Mr. Scheps would say otherwise. In fact, using just a single plugin will degrade your sound and phase much worse than any round trip of A to DA conversion. You can even ironically fix a piece of audio, bringing it back into an electrical signal, and then working with an analog chain before recapture/conversion. Just look to what most professional mastering engineers do, and I promise you that 99% of their chain is not in the box. If you're watching this video via YouTube, you may be familiar with modern-day guys like YouTube personality Glenn Fricker and his channel Spectre Sonic Studios, who plays the working man average Joe recording engineer. His big push on bands and artists is to use the real drums instead of samples and triggers, real playing, no time alignment, no auto-tune, and get your sound as genuine as possible. And I must say, I love this thought process. I hope this continues to be the narrative for the next generation of music makers. But Glenn, why? Why only go halfway? If real drums and amps and instruments are better, then why stick a fake 1176 or any other plugin on top of it in your tracks or mixes? Then you have Warren Hewitt of Produce Like a Pro, who I also really appreciate. He has said that there is no wrong way, and I love this mentality despite what I'm presenting to you in this video. He has also said that he didn't feel comfortable using plugins across his mix bus, and that you can get away with plugins in the mix as long as it's tracked right. Let's think about that for a second, because circling back to Sheps, he says similar things, both expressing the importance of tracking with real gear in the chain. Here lies another contradiction. If the plugins are just as good, why would tracking with hardware matter? It certainly doesn't align with these interface makers like Universal Audio and others' narrative of pushing products where you can slap a fake Neve 1073 plugin after your microphone and print it into your DAW on the way in. So it all comes down to convenience and compromise. Easy sell, easy buy. Why sell a $10,000 compressor to one person when you can sell a $100 piece of software to 100,000 people? When you think in these terms, it's easy to see why audio is becoming not unlike a 99-cent McDonald's cheeseburger. Quick, cheap, and convenient, but with little sustenance. Like any craft, there will be hobbyists, but there will also be the people that take it seriously and want to do it professionally. Most will give up, but the companies will have done their job. They will have sold you an X number of products and a dream. So be warned, the carrot is always changing and the pursuit is never ending, especially when you fall into such traps and schools of thought. They will push a certain plugin and claim that it sounds just like the real thing until the HD version comes out a few years later. And mark my words, the new and improved versions will be coming and continue to keep coming, just as they always have. And this isn't a bad thing. Just know that this is the case. In a Sound on Sound magazine interview from 2008, mixing engineer Rich Costey, who mixed the Foo Fighters song The Pretender, which is one of the most successful alternative rock songs in history of American music, said this: "I don't tend to use the plugins that much. They're really not that interesting in my opinion." And so, if you are still following along with me and are now feeling a little despair, don't panic, don't be discouraged, just know that this is the truth. And then for those of you following along shaking your heads, ask yourself this: how much experience do I truly have working with the plugins and then their hardware counterparts? And then how much experience do I have actually shooting out both? Sometimes it's hard to separate our own experiences from what we're told when we're fed so much rhetoric. Look, at the end of the day, work with what you have and learn from it. I used to use software exclusively for many, many years, and I always fought to find their very limited sweet spots, but they can be found. You can, as Mr. Lord-Alge put it, make it work. The only way that you'll truly know is if you find out for yourself. And it doesn't automatically mean that all hardware is superior, although in most cases it is. It doesn't let the likes of Warm Audio and other inexpensive clones off the hook. They just happen to be selling you the next stage in your quest to catch that delicious carrot. But that's for another time. As they say, trust your ears, but know that your ears can lie and play tricks on you. Know that audio is multidimensional. Know that mixing itself is one big compromise. Some will say the gear doesn't matter, but then use all the fake versions of the real stuff. The greats will say your ears are what matter, while selling you said fake version in the eye of using and owning walls upon walls of hardware units in multi-million-dollar studios. For me, my ears continue to evolve over the 15 years of me obsessively fiddling with audio equipment. And those ears continue to drive me to the proper tools. Those proper sonic tools 99% of the time being hardware, and all while in spite being drastically less convenient. But my personal quest is not that of convenience. So I pose to you, what is yours? For those using these plugins, assuming it's just as good, because that's what you keep being sold, I hope you simply enjoy the journey and it takes you far enough to find that out for yourself. For those who say it doesn't matter, well, then I guess nothing does. And I'll see you in a forest where we can sit and meditate until we simply whittle away and cease to exist. For me, the gear is a simple reflection of my ear and my technique, and although not always the easiest route, I find that it is most often the best.